Winterview, car dialogue, in-car dialogue. Winterview is driving to work. Right, so apologies at the start of this dialogue for background audio interference, probably from the engine, maybe from traffic, and most definitely running down pedestrians, because that's how I roll. Now, this morning's dialogue to my dear friend Anastasi, a question I get very often emailed to me. Sometimes I hear other people ask similar variants of this question, so I thought I would try and tackle it. It's a sticking point often for the mind to comprehend when talking about enlightenment, non-dual awareness, that type of stuff, that type of deal. And it's about this self, this person that I think I am, or I assume myself to be. It's such a mind-bending subject to talk about as well. So I end up often torturing language or stretching definitions just to even get a grip on the whole topic. So apologies in advance, but by the way, it's a lovely day. Sunny, 28 degrees Celsius. For my American friends, that's... Actually, I don't know what that is. Maybe in the 70s, 80s, low 80s perhaps. Beautiful day. And back to the self. It seems right now, as you listen, that there's a you listening. I'm hearing this dialogue. It seems also that Winterview must be giving the dialogue. Winterview is talking and I am hearing it. A perfectly normal, natural assumption. Yet, I've heard there is no self. There's no person inside this body who is taking in the sound and processing it. And that blows my freaking mind. How can that be so? So we'll try and unpack that a little bit in the next 20 minutes or so before I stop for my large flat white no sugar thank you very much. For my American friends, that's just a large coffee with milk, basically. So if we start with a suggestion, the first suggestion is this: that language, helpful as it is in communication, is very unhelpful in this particular instance. The reason is that language, words if you like, give the appearance that the word points to something in reality. Hold that thought. It points to something in reality. So if I say the word car, the mind flashes an image of a car. If I say your car, the mind will think of your car straight away, giving the illusion, if you like, that the word car, or the phrase my car, and the object car are one and the same thing. And it does it so perfectly, so innocently, and so seamlessly that as language is spoken or heard, the mind translates it rapidly as if it's real, as if language absolutely is the real deal. It doesn't take a lot of mental gymnastics to see that the word car and the object car are actually two separate things, if you like. But if we push that a little bit further to look at the object car, we find when we look at a car, if you choose any car, that when you start to really look at it, the word car is inadequate. The experience of a car in real life is quite rich and varied. There's colours, there's textures, there's sounds if the engine's on. There's a lot more going on in the real deal experience of car than the word car conjures up. So even when we try and unpack the reality of car, we can see very easily that language starts to fall short, which gives us a little inroads to perhaps that language, or the word, and the object are not necessarily the same. And in fact, one step further, perhaps they aren't even related. That's one way to look at this problem of self, because then when we turn back to self, word, we try and find a referent object for the word self, which we can't really, but we just say it's me or I, and we somehow just roll with that. And then if we're asked to look and explore in depth who this I is, who am I, it becomes really tricky. On the one hand, you could start rattling off statistics about yourself, historical facts about yourself. I was born here, I grew up here, I live here, I work as a such and such, I'm married to so and so, and on, and realizing at the same time that all these descriptors don't really capture you in your full essence. So just from a linguistic point of view, we can start to see that the self, or me, cannot be captured by words alone. That's one way to look at it. So when I say there's no self, no personal self, you can now start to see, yes, there's probably not that monolithic singular concept of self in existence. The next thing I wanted to say or talk about was, and I haven't really spoken much about this subject yet, but life only ever seems to appear in the most immediate instant. And I said in my earlier dialogue, a raw immediacy, trying to somehow capture that instantaneousness of life. And what that means, furthermore, what that means is that there's no history. History is an appearance, a dream if you prefer, and future hasn't happened, it's a fantasy that something might happen. So within that raw immediacy, there doesn't really exist anything. It's too fast to have an existence. So there's another way of looking at the fact that there's no self. Just in that instantaneousness, there isn't anything. The other way to look at this thing about there's no self is to look at life as it seems to unfold for most people. And for most people, life unfolds in a fairly predictable way most of the time. And it seems that you, the person, has a narrative or a story about your life that makes sense most of the time. You have a job, you grew up here. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Facts about yourself, but more than facts, put into a nice, neat narrative. And the narrative points to a central character in that narrative, you. Yet, when we look at it as a narrative, there's also, one can get a sense also that there's an arbitrariness about any narrative, in that we can change the descriptions of narratives, make them more detailed or less detailed. And that starts to also give fuzzy edges to that self. Okay? So the narrative is another way of looking at this self or lack of self. The other way to look at this, and this gets a little bit more mind-bendy, a bit more esoteric. Sorry, the road was a bit noisy there. Back onto good old smooth tarmac. The other way to look at this is to look at what the mind is trying to point to when it reports on self or me or I. The fact that the mind cannot seem to refute is that you exist, that you're here, that here I am, that sense of, yeah, I'm here, I'm in the world. Now we can agree probably that sure, maybe my description of the world or descriptions of the world don't match your descriptions of the world, and therefore I could grant you, we could argue about the details, and in that way narratives will differ, concepts will differ, but yet I cannot refute my existence. Which is an excellent point. So this is a place where people fall back to with this difficulty of understanding the self or the lack of self. Existence, once again, a word pointing to a concept, but we'll just leave it hanging there as if it's true. Existence seems to be that irrefutable baseline for any experience to occur. You have to exist to have an experience of any kind, whether it's self or selflessness, etc. The raw, immediate experience of life that cannot be captured, as I said earlier, is too immediate, sort of it transcends, well, that's a bad way of putting it, it just can't be captured by words. Yet, I seem to be here all the time experiencing it, whether it's the raw immediacy, whether it's a narrative, whether it's a concept. I'm the one seemingly in the middle to which this is all happening. This is where I struggle to explain this idea of self and no self, but I'm going to have a crack. Why not? The mind operates or is designed or functions within the presumption of cause and effect. And we know this because the mind, or thoughts that is, as they unfold, naturally presume cause. So every effect that is registered by the mind in the appearance of the world, the mind will naturally seek a corollary or an equal opposite of that, something that caused that phenomenon. You know, whether it's a fantasy cause or a scientific cause, it doesn't actually matter. The mind will look for a cause. The same thing happens with your existence. The mind registers existence, as in I exist, and then imbues a cause to existence. If I exist, or if there is existence, there must be someone who exists. So we come to the greatest hurdle or roadblock, I would say, for this understanding is the very structure of the way thought works, or the way the mind operates. It cannot comprehend non-cause and effect. It can get very clever about cause and effect, and you can start talking about the context and the content of the context, etc. But at the end of the day, it's still an attempt to figure out a cause, why this is happening, and it's happening because of this reason. So existence must be there because someone must be there to exist as far as the mind goes. So you cannot escape, or the mind cannot escape itself. No matter how hard it tries, it will always secretly believe in a person or a cause for existence. There cannot, as far as the mind is concerned, just be existence without anyone who exists. It just doesn't go down with the mind. But that seems to be closer to the truth, if there is such a thing. That all there is existence, within which appears the world, within which appears a person having the experience, a personal narrative within the world, a person who has duration. And this brings me to my next point on understanding the self. The mind, or thought, or the narrative, if you like, operates within what I call space-time, or the realm of space-time. Time and space are, in one sense, the same thing. But let's try and keep it very simple. The presumed self, this is now the mind talking, the presumed self must exist, says the mind. Here I am. And if I exist, I must have some objective quality, goes the thinking. Because if something does not have objective qualities, it can't exist. It doesn't exist. Therefore, there must be some objective quality. And if something has an objective quality, it must have duration. It must have a starting point and probably will have an ending point one day. And there we have time. So objective quality indicates that this occupies space, this self, and because it's an object, that it must have a start and will one day have an end, duration. So there's space and time. And the mind works in space-time. And thought operates within space-time. The world, as we think we know it, seems to operate in space-time. The mind cannot think outside of space-time, because it exists in space-time. It can hypothesize what it's like, but cannot know it. So, the appearance of the world, in general, appears to be within space and time. There appears to be stuff in the world that has some kind of duration across time. And therefore, coming back to the self, I do too, as in the self does too. And so in the so-called search for enlightenment, it's sometimes said that the self dissolves or goes away, or it's realized that there is no self. That realization happens, and this is a bit of a conceptual pretzel, it happens outside of space and time. Or, if you prefer, space-time just stops, and all that's left is the obvious. And the obvious is there is no self. I'm not entirely satisfied with that last little description of why there's no self. But coming back to my very first point, before I get to my coffee, as my brain runs out of fuel, it's a totally natural function of one's life to think there's a self at the center that runs the show, that makes the decisions, that chooses to do or not do stuff. It's not aberrant, it's not abnormal or weird or anything, And in the searching or seeking for enlightenment, there's often this funny idea that when I get rid of me, that old chestnut, then there will be enlightenment or liberation or realization, etc. And of course, if you spend a couple of seconds even thinking about that, it's absurd. There's no possible way that a self, which is entirely conceptual, can do anything. How is a concept going to even take the next breath? It can't. We won't get into it in this dialogue about the searching and the seeking and the moment of realization. I just wanted to cover some of the basics of the self. So there we have it. It's natural and normal for most functioning for there to appear to be a person in a body going through life doing stuff, in essence, that was born and will one day die. And that's how it is for space-time, the world of space-time. It's not wrong, it's not aberrant, it's not a mistake, it's not that the self is unfairly imprisoned in space-time, seeking to be liberated out of space-time. Space-time and the contents of space-time are just a story that unfolds very naturally in the day-to-day of life. There's no way a story is going to get out of the story. A character is going to escape the story, if you like. There's just no way. It's not going to happen. Liberation or enlightenment is you could say the end of the story, or you could say the seeing through of the story for what it is, a story. So everything that happens within the story is conceptual, and as I said earlier, a concept can't do anything. No concept has the agency, the power to do such and such a behavior. So in one sense, you could say it's like just watching a movie, but I don't like that metaphor at all, that analogy at all. That creates some conceptual problems down the road, so stay away from that one. But hold it there for the moment. Anyway, this has been a long enough brief dialogue. Any longer and it would not be a brief dialogue, I think. This has been Winterview, signing off for now. Apologies for the background car noise.